Hi, friends. It's good to be able to be together yet again this Sunday. And as we went through this past week, I was delighted to receive a note from one of the young families in the congregation where some of the kids and one of the youth in that family were looking at some of the symbols that surround us in worship each week, and they were wondering what they meant. And specifically, they asked about what looks like an A here and this letter that looks kind of like an upside down U, or a little bit like a horseshoe. And so I thank Brody and Jackson and Dylan today for your wonderful inquisitiveness that has spurred the conversation that we're going to have together this morning. I think sometimes adults are a little afraid to admit that they don't know things, and so I'm especially thankful for the bravery of some of our children and youth who ask the questions that often many of us are asking. And so I want to look also, as we look at what looks like an A and what looks like an upside down U, and I want to look at this symbol here, that it looks kind of smushed together, but if you pull it apart, it actually looks like an I, an H, and an S all stacked on top of each other. And I also want to talk about over on the front of the pulpit, it looks like a P stacked over top of an X. And so all of these, even though they look kind of like English letters, they're actually letters in the Greek alphabet. And they're letters and symbols that you can find plastered around churches all around the world. So wherever you go, you'll find that these are common symbols that Christians use no matter what their native language is to speak to the faith that they hold in the God that we worship. And so if we begin in the middle here of the altar, we have what looks like an I, an H, and an S. And those who don't know Greek have often tried to create phrases or acronyms that say, oh, well, it must stand for in his service. And that's cute and that's nice, but that's not actually what it means. What it is a iota. The one that looks like an I is a Greek letter iota. The one that looks like an H is the Greek letter for eta. And the one that looks like an S is the Greek letter for sigma. And so what those three Greek letters are is actually the first three letters in the name of Jesus in the Greek. And so, right at the dead center of our altar, what do we remind ourselves about who we're here to worship? We're here to worship Jesus. If you look over to the pulpit, you see what looks like a P stacked on top of an X. Those are actually the Greek letters chi, the X-looking letter, and rho, the P-looking letter. And when you put those two letters together in the Greek, those are actually the first two letters of Christ. So, again, as we gather in our churches and we see the iota, eta, sigma, and we see the chi and the rho all around us at churches, wherever we are in the world, no matter what language it is that we speak, we know that we are gathering together in a place that worships Jesus as the Christ. And finally, as we look here at what looks like an A and an upside down U, we know that these are actually the Greek letters for Alpha and Omega. They're the first and the last letter in the Greek alphabet. We get these symbols from the book of Revelation, where God speaks several times saying, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. And what we get there is actually an incredibly affirming and comforting and uplifting message. That as we come together as Christians, we don't just worship a God who is a fad for a particular culture or time, but we worship the God who was there in the beginning before anything else was, and we worship the God who is going to be there in the end after everything else has been. And so what's comforting about that is as we find ourselves in a world where things are constantly shifting below our feet, where we worry about coronavirus or our financial stability or getting along with our neighbor or threats all over the place or whatever worry or fear or thing that feels unstable in our life that may have our attention, as we gather together in church and we see the Alpha and the Omega, we remember that we worship the God who is here before our struggles, and we worship the God who will continue to be after our struggles are done. And so, as we worship, we know that we are connecting with, that we are attaching ourselves to, that we are singing the praise of the God who is strong and lasting and who transcends everything, and who is our sure and certain hope for the long haul. And so, friends, I hope that's helpful as we look at some of the symbols that have surrounded us every day of worship for years and years and years here. These symbols connect us with Christians all around the world, no matter what language we speak or place that we worship in. And they also remind us of the hope that we have in God, and specifically of the wonderful and gracious God that we worship. I thank you for your time today, and I can't wait to see you next week again. God bless you, dear friends.